Hello and welcome. My name is Aidan Thornton and I'm pleased to present this lecture on the lectical scale for Module 3 of LAP-1. You'll notice the nested spiral-shaped image on the right-hand side of this slide. This is an illustration of some key aspects of the developmental scale which we'll be exploring through this module. Our reason for depicting the developmental scale as nested spirals may become a little clearer as you progress. This lecture is based on over 120 years of theory and research in the way humans develop through the lifespan. We'll be touching on just a little of this theory to give you a sense of the enormous body of work which lies behind the lectical scale. But don't worry, there's no need for you to understand all of this theory in any depth. Our main objective is to make this lecture as practical as possible so you can quickly apply your growing understanding of the lectical scale and the virtuous cycle of learning plus 7 to your work. A full understanding of adult development takes years to build, and we don't have time in this lecture to go into detailed background material or full explanations of theory. If you are interested in taking that deep dive, we suggest you look into the Foundations of Lectical Assessment lecture series, or FOLA for short. Our hope is that by the end of this lecture, you'll have a practical understanding of the lectical scale. We'll focus on achieving 3 learning outcomes. 1. To provide a description of the scale, including a number of practical examples. 2. We'll talk through the application of the scale to adult development, which will help you work with adults who are performing at different lectical levels. And 3. We'll explore plenty of pragmatic ideas you can use when you sit down to conduct debriefs or coaching sessions with your clients. To achieve these learning outcomes, we'll follow the agenda on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, we'll begin with a quick quiz to check your current understanding of the lectical scale and lectical levels. Then, we'll move to a short overview of measurement in psychology and discuss how the lectical assessments fit into the big picture. Then I'll move on to introduce you to the lectical scale and show why it's such an extraordinary breakthrough in the way we think about measuring the development of human performance. I'll then shift gears and guide you through a deep dive into adult development. Here, we're mostly interested in 4 zones of adult development, including advanced linear thinking, early systems thinking, advanced systems thinking, and early principles thinking. These zones cover approximately 99% of the adult population and should be more than adequate to give you a good sense of how to support the adults you work with, but more about that shortly. Finally, we'll revisit the quick quiz and see how your understanding may have changed through the lecture. I do want to emphasize that this is possibly one of the most fascinating and intellectually challenging modules in LAP-1. It's easy to be theoretical about the lectical scale and its levels. It is a theoretical model after all. At the same time, we understand that what practitioners need to know is how to improve the quality of their conversations, debriefs, and coaching sessions when sitting in front of a client. So with that in mind, I really hope you enjoy the ride ahead. In keeping with our tradition in LAP-1, I'll present you with some statements which I'd like you to rate as true, false, or it depends. Number 1, it's always better to operate at your highest possible developmental level. Number 2, in essence, lectical assessments measure 2 fundamental things: the hierarchical complexity and quality of performance. Number 3, a score on the lectical scale represents a person's general level of development. Number 4, advanced systems thinkers are no longer able to do linear thinking. Number 5, most 21st century adults primarily do linear thinking. Number 6, the lectical scale describes the key steps in human evolution that build towards spiritual enlightenment. Number 7, advanced linear thinkers are able to integrate multiple abstract ideas. Number 8, the lectical scale represents a fundamental underlying property of complexity, which is why it correlates highly with every longitudinally verified developmental scale. Number 9, the lectical assessment system can only be used to measure a limited number of skills, including self-understanding, decision-making, and ethical reasoning. If you haven't done so already, grab a pen and paper and jot down whether your answer to each of these statements is true, false, or it depends. We'll revisit the quiz at the end of the lecture to see how close you got and whether any of your responses changed. So what should you watch out for in this presentation? There are a number of questions I'd like to ask you to reflect on as we progress with this lecture. Number 1, which one of the 3 assessment approaches, details to come, do you typically use or have you typically used in your work? Number 2, what are the ways in which the lectical scale differs from other scales you currently use or have used in the past? Number 3, how would you explain the 4 main adult development zones to your friend's grandmother? Number 4, describe 2 powerful debriefing or coaching questions that could be posed at each of the 4 main adult development zones. I've got a final question for those of you who are more familiar with developmental theory or have used a different approach to measuring vertical development. Specifically, how would you compare and contrast the lectical scale with other vertical development scales that you use? What are 2 similarities and 2 differences? I want to begin by exploring psychological assessment from multiple perspectives. Let's imagine that I'm involved in some complex initiative in which I need to have razor-sharp decision-making skills. My first step might be to assess my current level of skill. There are a number of ways I could go about doing this, and each of which involves a different perspective. A first-person perspective would involve my subjective opinion of my own decision-making. For example, I could ask myself how good I am at decision-making when making decisions individually and collectively. I could ask myself about my internal experience of making decisions. Maybe I feel anxiety when I make certain types of decisions, or confidence when making others. Other examples of first-person perspectives might include self-ratings via a 360-degree survey, a personality test, or other opinion-based surveys. But maybe I want to go deeper and find out more about my decision-making skills. If I wanted a second-person perspective, I could ask Theo for her personal opinion of my decision-making behavior. Maybe she could share some insights about the behavioral style I typically use, specific behaviors she's noticed, or her experience of engaging in a decision-making process with me. Other examples of second-person perspectives might include others' ratings via a 360-degree survey, behavioral interviews, and role plays. But maybe I want to go deeper still and find out even more about my decision-making skills. If I wanted a third-person perspective, I could take an LDMA, which would give me a more objective assessment of my decision-making skills. Of course, the LDMA isn't completely objective because humans are involved in coding it after all. But nonetheless, it's far more objective than just asking myself or asking Theo for an opinion. The LDMA is more objective because coders don't know whose assessment they're coding, and they examine an actual performance of my decision-making skills using standardized criteria. Moreover, the lectical score itself is increasingly determined by purely objective criteria. Other examples of third-person assessments include other lectical assessments and several other types of educational assessments. I'm keen to emphasize that all of these assessments are valuable and I can get important insights about my decision-making skills from all 3 perspectives. But I'm better off overall if I tap into all 3. However, as we scan the history of adult psychology, it's easy to see that there's been a very strong emphasis, some people might say an overemphasis, on first-person and second-person perspectives. This is why so many psychological instruments are surveys. While surveys are a useful way of gathering opinions and exploring attitudes, they don't directly assess human performance. Lectica's third-person perspective, which focuses on the assessment of skills, fills a gap in adult assessments by offering insights which we can't obtain via any other means. So what do lectical assessments measure anyway? Well, as we discussed briefly in Module 1, lectical assessments assess the performance of an individual, viewed as an integrated human system, in a particular context and in a specific area of skill. We assume that the level of performance on any lectical assessment is influenced by several aspects of self, including conscious cognition, System 2, emotion, past and present, motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic, intuition, System 1, and behavior, or what you actually did. Consequently, we don't make the claim that we're capable of producing a score that is a pure indicator of cognitive capacity. Every performance is embedded in a context, is about a specific context, and involves conscious cognition, emotion, motivation, intuition, and behavior. So with that in mind, what's actually in a lectical report? Well, all lectical assessments measure two fundamental aspects of performance: hierarchical complexity, or lectical level, and quality. You can think of this as the quality of the knowledge network as it shows up in a performance. I'd like to start by saying a few words about complexity. Lectical assessments have arisen from a developmental tradition that is often called cognitive developmental psychology, in which one primary focus is on a phenomenon called hierarchical complexity. This is a specific form of complexity that involves not only an increase in the number of ideas we have, but also the way in which these ideas are related to one another. Each new level of development involves the emergence of either a new kind of idea or a new way of organizing ideas, a structure. These new ideas and structures build on the ideas and structures of the previous level. Put simply, hierarchical complexity means that each developmental level forms the basis for the next developmental level, and therefore forms a hierarchy. From a practitioner perspective, we recognize that talking about hierarchical complexity feels incredibly theoretical and isn't a useful way to speak with clients. When speaking with more academic groups, we refer to levels of hierarchical complexity as lectical levels, or sometimes skill levels. When we're speaking with our clients, practitioners, and test takers, we use terms like level of skill, skill mastery, or simply mastery. At Lectica, we don't use the term vertical development because it doesn't really capture what we understand about the human development process. We sometimes use this term when it's already in use by a particular client. The advantage of using terms like level of skill, skill mastery, and mastery is that they're comfortable terms that represent something that most adults value. Let's move on to discussing quality. The primary way in which we determine the quality of performance is by examining its arguments for coherence. How well do its arguments hang together? Are there holes in the logic? Do they relate to the questions asked in the assessment? Are they relevant? By examining these aspects of a performance, we can get a sense of how well connected a test taker's knowledge network is and diagnose specific problems. For example, we can often tell if an individual has gaps in his or her knowledge or skills that need to be filled in before being nudged to the next level. As we learnt in Module 2, having a robust knowledge network is characterized by numerous meaningful associations between concepts and is absolutely necessary for optimal ongoing development. So where did the lectical levels come from? I want to spend a few moments providing you with a little of the theoretical and research background on the lectical scale and some of its properties before we dive into the pragmatics of the lectical levels. As I mentioned at the start of this lecture, the lectical scale is based on over 120 years of theory and research in human development. In fact, the earliest version of something that crudely resembles the developmental scale dates back to the late 1800s with the work of James Mark Baldwin. Currently, in the area of human development, there are three basic orientations to lifespan development. The first orientation has emerged from the psychodynamic tradition and includes Lovinger's and Cook-Greuter's ego development theories, and to some extent, Kegan's subject-object theory. The second orientation is towards spiritual development and is associated with the work of Ken Wilber, Jenny Wade, and Aurobindo. The third orientation is neo-Piagetian and includes Piaget himself, along with Fisher, Case, Selman, Kohlberg, Kitchener and King, Arman, Dawson, and many others. The neo-Piagetians built upon Piaget's staggering body of work, adding additional refinements to our understanding of developmental processes and developmental levels. Dr. Dawson chose to work in the neo-Piagetian tradition because she found it to be the most theoretically rigorous, most empirically tested, and most likely to lend itself to practical applications. That said, although the lectical scale has emerged from the neo-Piagetian tradition, our understanding of learning and development borrows from observations made by researchers in many traditions, including social learning theory, constructivist pedagogy, prospect theory, and developmental neuroscience, not to mention our own work. There are several developmental models that most strongly influence the development of the lectical scale. They include Common's model of hierarchical complexity, Fisher's dynamic skill theory, Kohlberg's moral judgment interview, Armand's stages of reasoning about the good life, and Perry's and Kitchener and King's reflective judgment models. All of these models were developed during the latter half of the 20th century. Kohlberg, Armand, Perry, and his colleagues, Kitchener and King, did some of the best longitudinal research on development that has ever been done, producing high-quality, domain-specific developmental assessment systems. Commons and Fisher took a different path. They continued Piaget's search for a way of characterizing development independent of any particular content or content domains. Both provided well-researched models that describe levels of hierarchical complexity. Through a series of studies in the 1990s and early 2000s, Dawson showed that Commons, Fisher's, Kohlberg's, Perry's, and Armand's scales all tapped into the very same underlying construct, which she called hierarchical complexity. Today, the lectical scale can best be characterized as a refinement of Fisher's skill scale. This is with Fisher's blessing, of course. The lectical assessment system, the LAS, and its computerized version, CLASS, which are used to place performances on the lectical scale, have achieved a level of accuracy and reliability that meet the standards for educational and psychological testing developed jointly by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education. We'll now see how all of this research has formed the basis of the lectical assessment system as a developmental ruler. During daily life, we probably don't even notice how many different metrics we use, such as those that measure temperature, length, or weight. When we use one of these measures, we're actually describing a fundamental aspect of nature, such as distance, time, mass, brightness, or temperature. Let's take temperature as an example. I can use a thermometer to measure a warm summer's day in Melbourne, Australia, the ice caps in the Arctic Circle, or even the surface of the sun. That is, I can use this thermometer to measure the temperature of absolutely anything that has a temperature. Well, the lectical assessment system works in the same way. It allows us to measure another fundamental aspect of nature, hierarchical complexity, and it can be used to measure the hierarchical complexity of anything that has hierarchical complexity. For this reason, the LAS is very powerful indeed. Let me step you through 4 reasons why. First, lectical levels are non-arbitrary. Each level in the sequence builds upon an earlier level in a non-arbitrary sequence. Put simply, the levels are hierarchical because each level provides the foundation for the next level, which means that lectical levels can't unfold in any other order. Second, the LAS is content independent. This means it can be used to measure the complexity of any content that exhibits hierarchical complexity. And this is a key benefit of the LAS compared to domain-specific scoring systems. Some of you may be familiar with Keegan's evolving self or Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development model. The scoring systems developed for these systems measure only ego development or the evolving self. They're not content independent like a thermometer or a ruler. But this simply isn't the case with the lectical scale. It isn't restricted to any specific skill or type of content. such as the self, as in the case of an ego development instrument. So it can be used to measure anything with hierarchical complexity, including the development of self-understanding. For example, you could use the lectical scale to measure the lectical level of the behavior of a 6-month-old baby playing with a rattle, the behavior of a mother bird feeding its baby birds in a nest, the operations of a car manufacturing plant, a new theory in physics, the requirements of a senior executive role, or any reason-based argument. Because the lectical scale can be used so broadly, we can compare the complexity of one thing with the complexity of another thing on a single scale. For example, I could compare my decision-making skills with my self-understanding skills, or I could compare an executive's ethical reasoning skills with the complexity of her role to see if she's experiencing the complexity gap. Third, lectical scores correlate very strongly with those of other longitudinally validated developmental scoring systems. Interestingly, however, lectical scores are less strongly related to scores obtained with systems that have not been subjected to extensive longitudinal validation. Finally, Lectica's work is rigorous. Our scores meet the highest possible standards of psychometric reliability and validity. This means you can have confidence that lectical scores are accurate within a narrow margin of error. I want to spend a moment talking you through the big picture of the lectical scale at 4 levels of detail, and then we can quickly move into a discussion about adult development levels and how to take advantage of them during debriefs and coaching sessions. So we've already mentioned that the lectical scale is a scale of increasing hierarchical complexity, or in plainer English, it's a scale of increasing skill. At the broadest level, the scale consists of 5 tiers. The reflexes tier comes online from pre-birth to about 3 months. In the reflexes tier, infants use basic senses, such as sight, sound, taste, and smell, to take in the world around them. Their interactions with people and objects either result from reflexes, such as the sucking reflex, or built-in tendencies to orient themselves towards sound, movement, or faces. Or they result from accidental encounters, as when a waving hand makes contact with a rattle or a stuffed animal. The actions tier comes online from about 3 months to 18 months. In the actions tier, infants engage in intentional actions that become increasingly complex over time. For example, they first learn to reach for an object, then to hold it, then to shake it to make a sound. Or they gradually learn that certain behaviors will make a parent react in particular ways. These skills and others like them become increasingly complex until we have a crawling baby that can interact effectively with many objects, including people, in his or her environment, and even use gestures or words as signals. The representations tier comes online from about 18 months to 8 years. In the representations tier, children begin to use gestures and words to represent actions, feelings, or objects, gradually moving from single words to sentences, and finally to stories about the concrete world. One way to wrap your head around the representations tier is to think about it as the tier in which it's fairly easy to represent ideas with pictures. The abstractions tier comes online from about 8 years onwards. In this tier, children begin to integrate their concrete experience to form abstract generalizations. They no longer need to tell stories about several instances of fairness to get the idea across that someone is fair. They can now sum it all up in 4 words. She's a fair person. Starting with this kind of simple, abstract generalization, people move through the ability to make logical arguments with abstractions, and then to the ability to construct systems of ideas that coordinate relations between large numbers of abstractions. The principles tier can come online from about age 26 onwards, but it's found in less than 1% of the adult population. In this tier, adults construct overarching ideas or principles that coordinate several systems of abstractions by identifying their core commonalities. Although these tiers must unfold in this order, the age ranges vary from individual to individual. depending on genetic makeup, cultural context, education, and so forth. At the next level of detail, we have the 14 lectical levels. These are the same 14 levels we saw previously. Again, there's an academic way and a practitioner's way to think about these 14 levels. From an academic perspective, we talk about 14 levels of increasing hierarchical complexity. But from a practitioner's perspective, we simply talk about increasing levels of skill or levels of mastery. At the next level of detail, each of the 14 lectical levels can be further broken down into two zones, an early zone and an advanced zone. This helps us to make finer distinctions within each developmental level, and we'll see very shortly why this is so useful. Finally, we can also break each of the 14 lectical levels down into 8 phases. This helps us to make even finer distinctions about how people grow within each level, and is a level of granularity of Lectica's computerized class scores. So let's just pause for a moment to catch our breath. If you're anything like me, just looking at this diagram can make you feel like you're in over your head. But don't worry, you don't need to know all of this detail. I simply wanted to show you the entire lectical scale end to end so you can better understand how adult development fits in. After I talk you through the 14 lectical levels in just a moment, I'm going to zoom into the 4 zones of adult development, which include the advanced zone of level 10, or advanced linear thinking, the early zone of level 11, or early systems thinking, the advanced zone of level 11, or advanced systems thinking, and the early zone of level 12, or early principles thinking. Just to provide you with a little more reassurance, the 8 phases per level is really only useful for Lectica, since we're trying to understand human growth through a magnifying glass. There's absolutely no need for you to get to this level of understanding whatsoever. But if you feel as if you must, you may think about becoming one of us. The zones, however, are very useful for practitioners and academics, and the 4 zones of adult development will be focused on capture over 99% of the whole adult population. Now I want to give you a brief overview of how humans develop through all 14 lectical levels. I've been introducing jargon like hierarchical complexity, representations, abstractions, and principles, but now I want to give you some concrete examples so you can actually see what this looks like in practice. Remember, hierarchical complexity simply means that each developmental level provides the foundation for the next developmental level, and this means that lectical levels unfold only in one sequence. Let's take a closer look. Level 1 includes simple reflexes involving movements of the eyes, the lips, the head, and the limbs. At level 2, babies are reaching, touching, grabbing, and shaking. At level 3, babies are crawling, climbing, standing, and babbling. At level 4, toddlers begin using words or gestures as signals, such as up, down, uh-oh, mama, and papa. At level 5, young children use simple concrete words or phrases as signs, such as put in house, go outside, jump on bed, red button, little baby. At level 6, young children construct simple sentences with concrete subjects and objects, such as I have a train, I go outside, my car goes vroom vroom. At level 7, children begin connecting concrete ideas in this then that sentences, such as a good leader is in front so she can show you the way. At level 8, they begin telling stories with multiple concrete elements, such as a good teacher is fun to have because she shows you how to do lots of stuff and will show you how. At level 9, children construct single abstract ideas, such as a good teacher makes learning fun. At level 10, adolescents use these abstract ideas in logical if-then statements, such as A good teacher inspires children, which makes them want to learn. At level 11, adults construct systems of abstractions, such as, to inspire children, you need to identify their interests and capabilities so you can tailor learning to meet their needs. At level 12, a few adults begin extracting principles that organize systems of abstractions, such as Darwin's conception of natural selection or the Dalai Lama's conception of compassion. At level 13, even fewer adults relate principles to build new paradigms of thought, such as general systems theory or rules theory of justice. And at level 14, we simply don't understand because we're just not there yet. I hope you can see how performance becomes more and more complex at each developmental level, with each level providing the foundation for the next level. So why do lectical assessments have scores? All reports from lectical assessments provide a developmental score. In the adult assessments, this is typically found on the Your Reasoning tab. You can see that this person got a score of 11.5. We have three main reasons for providing lectical scores. The first is to help you to identify your client's growth edge by providing an answer to the question, how much of the world does my client seem to see? The second is to identify what's next in your client's development, so you can answer the question, how can I tailor the virtuous cycle of learning and developmental practices to meet my client's unique needs? The third is to help you track development by providing an answer to the question, how much did my client grow over the past 6 to 12 months? It's really important to highlight that lectical scores are a reflection of your client's performance on a particular skill, in a particular context, at a particular time. Unlike other developmental models, we don't claim to score people's minds or their consciousness. We can't possibly read people's minds. Moreover, there is no evidence to support the view that an individual's developmental level is the same in different skill areas or in every situation. For all of these reasons, we never talk about someone being at a developmental level. A lectical score reflects performance on a particular assessment at a particular time, and nothing else. So with this background in mind, let's begin our exploration of the 4 zones of adult development by introducing the concept of decentering. If you've ever used a fancy camera, you'll know what I mean by using a wide-angle lens. When we use a wide-angle lens, we make it possible to take in more of the scene before us. This ability to see more is very similar to what we mean by decentering, in which we open our field of awareness by quite literally perceiving, understanding, predicting, and influencing more of the internal and external world. Let's look at how social decentering looks in the 4 zones of adult development. The first adult zone, with scores between 10.5 and 10.9, is called advanced linear thinking. In this zone, we already have a fairly wide view compared to the much more restricted view from earlier levels, starting with me at level 0. Typically, the focus in this zone is on small groups and their particular qualities, my family, my team, my clique, my tribe, or individuals with particular personalities, skills, attributes, habits, or points of view. In early systems thinking, between 11.0 and 11.4 on the lectical scale, our ability to relate variables in nonlinear ways make it possible to widen the view a little more. In this phase, we tend to see individuals and groups, which include teams, communities, and organizations in general, in terms of well-differentiated sets of qualities, roles, and kinds of relationships. In advanced systems thinking, between 11.5 and 11.9 on the lectical scale, our increasing capacity to identify interrelationships amongst variables allows us to widen the view even further. We're now able to see how the qualities of groups affect their interactions with one another and with the larger systems in which they're embedded. Finally, in early principles thinking between 12.0 and 12.4 on the lectical scale, the view widens again by distilling a few broad principles that can be used to guide our thinking about things like multiple dynamic organizational and social systems that form marketplaces, economies, and societies. So in each zone of adult development, we decenter by expanding our field of awareness, which gives us an opportunity to perceive, understand, predict, and influence more of the internal and external world. Let's continue our dive into adult development by seeing how this concept of decentering applies to decision-making, self-understanding, and a few other key skills. We can see that advanced linear thinking is prevalent in approximately 60% of the adult population, early systems thinking in approximately 30%, advanced systems thinking in approximately 9%, and early principles thinking in less than 1% of the adult population. How do the zones line up with typical management layers? Advanced linear thinking is usually adequate for frontline team members, early systems for junior supervisors through to middle management, advanced systems for middle managers through to senior managers, and early principles for senior managers up to top executive management. In terms of decision-making processes, advanced linear thinkers tend to weigh up different options by figuring out which option is better and then choosing it. At early systems, this becomes balancing options, in which we identify the strengths and weaknesses of different options and find a solution that has the most strengths and fewest weaknesses. Advanced systems thinkers tend to focus on bridging options, which involves finding areas of commonality between different options and using these commonalities as a starting place for a decision. Early principles thinkers focus on synthesis by identifying the unstated commonalities at the root of different options and using these commonalities to define principles that can guide an entire decision-making process. Let's examine how this looks in terms of how the self is perceived. Advanced linear thinkers describe themselves in terms of a collection of personal qualities and are likely to distinguish between an inner true self and an outer self. Early systems thinkers describe themselves as having numerous, sometimes competing aspects or qualities, and are likely to view the self through the lens of different life roles, including mentor, leader, partner, parent, and so on. Advanced systems thinkers describe themselves as both multifaceted and having continuity over time, and understand that context plays an enormous role in how the self shows up in any given moment or develops over time. Single principles thinkers describe themselves as emerging from the dynamic interplay of multiple internal and external systems. Moving on to the sense of stability in self, in advanced linear thinking, the self is seen as stable, although growing more knowledgeable and experienced over time. In early systems, some aspects of the self are seen as fixed, such as values and temperament, and other aspects are seen as changeable, including interests and social skills. In advanced systems, the self is seen as both stable and adaptive, with limits imposed by nature and nurture. In early principles, the self is perceived to be emergent as it continues to evolve in response to experience and the meaning made from that experience. Let's continue our exploration of the 4 zones of adult development by discussing humility and agility, beginning with humility. In advanced linear thinking, the focus is on my perspective. Advanced linear thinkers are likely to make decisions based primarily upon their own way of seeing a situation. In early systems, the focus becomes our perspectives. Early systems thinkers appreciate that perspectives are limited and are likely to invite input from others prior to making a decision. I want to make it clear here that people can seek input from very early in development, but we've found it's not a common practice in decision making until early systems thinking. In advanced systems, the focus is on coordinating perspectives. Advanced system thinkers understand that perspectives are limited and fallible, and are likely to make others a key ingredient in the decision-making process. In early principles, the focus is on leveraging perspectives. Early principles thinkers can lead the design of systems, structures, and processes that compensate for the boundedness and fallibility of human perspectives. Let's continue by exploring agility. Advanced linear thinkers tend to focus on single solutions. They'll often suggest a second solution to a complex problem, but that second solution is either unworkable or is viewed as inferior to the first solution. Early systems thinkers tend to focus on identifying the stronger solution. They'll often suggest a second workable solution to a complex problem and identify some of its strengths, but generally view it as inferior to the first solution. Advanced systems thinkers tend to focus on multiple accessible solutions. They'll often generate multiple viable solutions to a complex problem and identify their relative strengths and weaknesses. Early principles thinkers tend to focus on adaptive solutions. They're able to facilitate effective and timely responses in a changing environment by rapidly generating multiple viable approaches to a wide range of highly complex problems. Let's continue by exploring tensions and polarities and contextual thinking, beginning with tensions and polarities. Advanced linear thinkers tend to focus on solving tensions, which involves identifying personal or interpersonal tensions in specific situations and seeing them as problems to solve. Early systems thinkers tend to focus on balancing tensions, which involves identifying common tensions that arise at different layers in an organizational hierarchy and attempting to balance them. Advanced systems thinkers tend to focus on dynamic tensions, which involves identifying several sources of tension within and between layers in the management hierarchy and striving to keep them in a dynamic balance. Early principles thinkers tend to focus on resolving tensions, which involves simplifying the complex by identifying basic principles that dissolve common tensions and polarities, and then using these principles to design systems, policies, and structures that optimize outcomes for all stakeholders. Let's finish this exploration of developmental zones with contextual thinking, in particular how it impacts the way we think about causes. In advanced linear thinking, the focus is on direct causes, for example, considering the people directly involved in a situation as possible causes. In early systems, local contexts are often seen as causes, such as the particular policies in my division or business unit. In advanced systems, broad contexts are often seen as possible causes, including contexts like systems, the culture, or company values. In early principles, the focus is on root causes, or aspects of the system that shape the contexts in which problems emerge. I hope you can see how the concept of decentering applies across all of these examples. In each successive zone, we expand our field of awareness to take in more of the world. As you can imagine, optimizing our ability to do this is absolutely necessary for all citizens of the 21st century, especially leaders. So helping others to construct these essential skills is a top priority for Lectica. To take our exploration of adult development to an even greater level of pragmatism, we'll now examine how each of the 4 zones might influence certain aspects of your coaching practice by considering how might someone performing in this zone show up for a debrief or a coaching session? What coaching questions might we ask? What practices would be effective? So how might advanced linear thinkers approach the session? They may understand the specifics in the report, but have more difficulty drawing out the broader implications. Have an overly confident perspective on themselves, so feel a little challenged by a more objective assessment of skill. Approach the feedback with relatively black and white thinking that makes it difficult to see nuances. For example, they may be unable to see the many factors which have led to their current level of skill, but instead zoom into one single factor instead. Finally, they may want the answer, so that if I do X, then I'll develop to level Y. What coaching questions might we ask of advanced linear thinkers? Of course, as all experienced coaches know, Coaching is such an intensely personal process, and there's no generic set of questions which will work for all clients. At the same time, we wanted to give you a sense of the type of questions that might be effective in each of the 4 zones. Here are some examples. What are some new ways we could look at this situation to get a better sense of what's really going on? How might the perspective of a particular person who wasn't considered affect your solution? Is there anything more about the team or organization that should be considered in this situation? Is there anything more about relationship X that should be considered in this situation? Is there a bigger picture perspective that should be taken into account? Can you be sure that X always leads to Y? What about additional variables not considered in the assessment responses? Can you think of a way to combine solutions X and Y? You'll notice that what we're trying to do with these coaching questions are 2 things. 1, improve the quality of the performance within the existing zone, and 2, open a window of possibility to the next zone. If an individual's lectical score is at the lower end of a zone, we put the emphasis on 1, improving the quality of thinking in the existing zone. If the individual's score is at the higher end of a zone and their argumentation scores are good, then we put the emphasis on 2, opening a window to the next zone. When individuals are poised for development to the next level, exposing them to ideas of the next level can prove to be an effective catalyst. Lectical assessments are designed to diagnose these very conditions. So what practices would be effective for advanced linear thinkers? First would be getting into the habit of considering multiple causes by routinely asking themselves questions like, what are some other impacts of X? Or what else could cause Y? Second would be building skills for perspective seeking and taking, which might include finding a mentor who can support them by helping to stretch their perspective, and also learning active listening skills, which can help to clarify others' perspectives and really step inside someone else's shoes. Finally, would be finding ways to support contextual thinking, which can be very helpful in surfacing factors that haven't yet been considered. Some ways to achieve this include Schein's iceberg model of organizational culture, shown on the right. This is an elegant way to highlight how many different levels and factors are truly at work when we analyze a workplace situation. We can also use mind mapping to help clients generate multiple factors or considerations and explore how they're related to one another. How might early systems thinkers approach the debrief? They may be more comfortable than advanced linear thinkers with some of the considerations or even some of the uncertainty thrown up by the report. Be more likely than advanced linear thinkers to welcome alternative perspectives, partially because they're more sensitive to shades of grey. Approach feedback with curiosity about the many factors that impact their thinking, such as, what are the goals of this assessment? Or, I wonder why I performed this way at this particular time. And struggle with prioritizing recommended learning activities and practices, because everything may seem equally important. Compared to advanced linear thinkers, early systems thinkers have a slightly greater sense of expansiveness in their thinking. This allows them to hold more complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty, but can also lead to a sense of being off balance or difficulty making choices. What coaching questions might we ask of early systems thinkers? Here are some examples. What do solutions X and Y have in common? Does being aware of this suggest an alternative approach to the problem? What are some other viable solutions? For slightly more advanced early systems thinkers, performing at around 11.3 to 11.4, we could ask, how could we build a bridge between different options, such as meeting the needs of staff, leaders, and the organization all at the same time? What aspects of the context might limit how the key stakeholders or you view the situation? What are the main tensions, such as competing needs or claims in the situation? Can any of these be resolved? Could we get a better understanding of these tensions by considering the broader context, such as the specific aspect of organizational dynamics, culture, or values. You may notice that these coaching questions have increased in complexity and scope compared with the questions for advanced linear thinkers, just as you might expect. So what practices might be effective for early systems thinkers? First, by continuing to take, seek, and coordinate perspectives, by cultivating a habit for looking for the grain of truth, even in the least attractive perspectives. Creating a personal advisory board, just like a project steering committee, which can be used to invite new perspectives or explore ideas. Building facilitation skills. This is a wonderful way of learning how to elicit perspectives, make distinctions, and also identify common themes. Second, by understanding perspectives. Considering how context influences perspectives, including how the context either enables or limits perspective taking and seeking. Third, understanding relationships between multiple factors, such as systems mapping to identify nodes or places where many ideas or factors connect with one another. How might advanced systems thinkers approach the debrief? They may be quite comfortable with the complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty of the report. Feel confident and competent when exploring multiple perspectives, including perspectives on themselves. Feel overwhelmed by their sensitivity to what once were shades of grey, but are now feeling more like kaleidoscopes, especially if their knowledge networks are underdeveloped, as evidenced in low argumentation scores. Feel like they're drowning in considerations, and for this reason, develop tunnel vision as a coping mechanism. Take a long view on personal development. In other words, seeing development as a long-term process rather than a quick fix. What coaching questions might we ask of advanced systems thinkers? Here are some examples. What does your sense of overwhelm tell you about how you're relating to the situation? How do the dynamics of the organizational system affect this situation? Where would you look for the root or systemic causes of this situation? What are the polarities implicated in this situation? Could there be a hidden order behind this complexity? Including, what are the main worldviews in play? In what ways might they share unexpected commonalities? Is it possible that we're all focused on achieving the same collective outcome? What practices would be effective for advanced systems thinkers? First, building advanced perspective coordination skills by learning to facilitate collaborative learning, or learning a formal consent-based decision-making process, such as sociocracy. Second, dealing with the emotional overwhelm from attempting to hold so much complexity. This might include some of the self-regulation practices we explored in Module 2, such as coherence practices or mindfulness. Third, seeking the common ground between different ideas or different perspectives, such as through systems mapping to identify shared elements of highly complex perspectives. How might early principles thinkers approach the session? They may appreciate the interconnected biological, psychological, and social processes that impact decision-making and self-understanding. Appreciate how individual factors, interpersonal factors, and environmental factors impact performance. Seek broad principles that can be applied to support ongoing development of themselves and others, such as applying the adage that all people should be treated as ends, not means, to their own lives and to the development of their environment. They may also connect the dialogue with a deeper and broader sense of meaning or purpose beyond the context of the workplace or their own life. Purposefully work towards integrating insights from multiple modalities, such as body, mind, and spirit, empirical and experiential, or different disciplines. So what coaching questions might we ask of early principles thinkers? Here are some examples. What are the personal, interpersonal, collective, community, and global factors that are relevant in this situation? What are the long-term outcomes that you or the organization are striving to achieve? How would you identify and address systemic causes in this kind of situation? What are the most fundamental principles or values that govern your thinking and action in this kind of situation? What are the fundamental principles or values that guide you when developing organizational systems, processes, and structures? What practices would be effective for early principles thinkers? First, refining principles. That is, naming the principles you're constructing so there's greater conscious awareness of principles and how they might be applied. Or mentally or actually testing them in real-world contexts, such as what would change if system X was governed by principle Y instead of principle Z? Second, communicating and relationship building. This includes learning how to communicate with everybody by avoiding academic language and jargon, and cultivating a network of peers that allows you to talk freely at the level of conversation which comes easily to you. Finally, cultivating creativity by broadening your knowledge and experience base so you can make connections that have never been made before. It's pretty obvious at this point that as we progress through each of the developmental zones, things get more and more complex. This includes the ability to hold more complexity and ambiguity about the assessment in particular and life in general, the types of coaching questions you may ask, and the developmental practices which may be most effective. Now that we've explored all 4 zones of adult development from so many different angles, let's take some time to apply what we've learnt by revisiting our true or false statements and reflection questions. Here are the true, false, or depends statements we began this lecture with. You may like to compare my answers with your original responses. 1. It's always better to operate at your highest possible developmental level. Well, it depends. The key is to access the level of skill required for the task at hand. Even if you can access early principles, there's no need for this while walking the dog or washing the dishes. However, if you happen to be a senior leader, you'll want to cultivate more advanced skills if you're frequently required to be making complex business decisions. 2. In essence, lectical assessments measure 2 fundamental things: the hierarchical complexity and quality of performance. This is true. Hierarchical complexity as the lectical score, and quality, which is related to the robustness of the neural network. These are not 2 distinct processes, but 2 sides of the very same coin. 3. A score on the lectical scale represents a person's general level of development. This is false. People are dynamic systems, and we've found no evidence to support the idea that people have a center of gravity at just one developmental level. Lectical scores reflect performance on particular topics in particular contexts, not a general structure of mind. 4. Advanced systems thinkers are no longer able to do linear thinking. This is false. People can readily access many of the skills of previous levels. In fact, advanced systems thinkers may often need to access linear thinking if they need to solve linear problems. However, there is a wrinkle. As we develop to higher and higher levels, the chunking we do at each developmental transition makes it harder to capture the details we were able to work with at earlier levels. There's a price for development. We decenter, but in the process we lose detail. This is why organizations are better off when employees' level of skill is a good match for their work level. Number 5. Most 21st century adults primarily do linear thinking. This is true. As we saw, around 60% of the adult population has yet to develop beyond linear thinking in at least one skill area. Number 6. The Lectical Scale describes the key steps in human evolution which build towards spiritual enlightenment. This is false. Unlike some other developmental models, this one does not describe any special relationship between development and spirituality. However, the Lectical Scale is content independent. It can be applied to any skills that develop in hierarchical complexity. Some spiritually oriented skills might include understanding spiritual texts, performing spiritual rituals, or inducing altered states of awareness in yourself. Number 7, advanced linear thinkers are able to integrate multiple abstract ideas. This is true. In fact, part of the definition of linear thinking is the integration of abstract ideas in if-then logical statements. Number 8, the lectical scale represents a fundamental underlying property of complexity, which is why it correlates highly with every longitudinally verified developmental scale. Well, it depends. The lectical scale seems to correlate highly with other developmental scales in the neo-Piagetian tradition, but research suggests that it may not correlate as well with psychodynamic scales such as ego development, because psychodynamic and spiritual development scales appear to be focused on phenomena that are fundamentally different from the developmental dimension represented by the lectical scale. And finally, number 9. The lectical assessment system can only be used to measure a limited number of skills, including self-understanding, decision-making, and ethical reasoning. This is false. The lectical scale is content-independent and can theoretically be used to assess any skill. It happens that Lectica's current focus is on decision-making, reflective judgment, self-understanding, and ethical reasoning, but this is just because these skills are particularly relevant to leaders in the 21st century. Let's briefly revisit the reflection questions we started the session with. 1. Which one of the 3 assessment approaches do you typically use, or have you typically used in your work? 2. What are a few ways in which the lectical scale differs from other scales you currently use, or have used in the past? 3. How would you explain the 4 main adult development zones to your friend's grandmother? 4. Describe 2 powerful debriefing or coaching questions that could be posed at each of the 4 main adult development zones. And 5, our final question is for those of you who are more familiar with the developmental approach, which is specifically, how would you compare and contrast the lectical scale with other vertical development scales you use? What are 2 similarities and 2 differences? I'd like to make some closing comments before we conclude this lecture. As we saw, psychological assessments tend to focus primarily on one of 3 different perspectives. First-person perspective, my perspective, second-person perspective, your perspective, or third-person perspective, a more objective stance. Lectica specializes in third-person assessment. Lectical assessments measure 2 fundamental aspects of human performance: hierarchical complexity and quality. Hierarchical complexity relates to vertical development, and quality relates to the robustness of the neural network. The lectical scale is built on 120 years of research into human development and is a developmental ruler that is non-arbitrary, content-independent, an accurate measure of hierarchical complexity, and highly rigorous in terms of reliability and validity. The hierarchical nature of lectical levels means that each new level is built on elements of the previous level. Therefore, the levels must unfold in a certain order. The lectical scale consists of 5 tiers and 14 levels, but most adults perform in 4 zones. Advanced linear thinking from 10.5 to 10.9, early systems thinking from 11.0 to 11.4, advanced systems thinking from 11.5 to 11.9, and finally early principles thinking from 12.0 to 12.4. Each of these zones has different implications for how people are likely to show up for a debrief or coaching session, potential coaching questions, and also developmental practices. In summary, it's exciting to imagine the diverse ways in which these ideas can be applied in practice. Understanding more about the processes of human growth in general and adult development in particular opens a whole new realm of possibilities for ways in which we can better understand and work with our clients. As we continue to put this knowledge to work, we have the opportunity to create conditions for significant shifts in the way leaders see the world and approach their calling to leadership. In doing so, we embrace a critical opportunity to transform the dynamics of education, organizational, social, and global systems towards greater states of health and well-being for the benefit of human civilization and the global ecosystem. This brings us to the conclusion of this session. I'd like to thank you for your attention and participation and look forward to seeing you in class. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.